Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how your brain learns new things and makes decisions, especially when it is tough? Well, get ready because we're diving into how your brain juggles learning from experience and holding information in mind to make choices. We've got a fascinating new study that uses a super clever game and brain recordings to figure this out. Imagine trying to learn a new set of rules, but your brain also has to remember them for a bit. That is kind of what this study is about. They looked at how reinforcement learning, which is learning from rewards and punishments, and working memory, which is like your brain's short-term notepad, work together when you have to make choices. It is like a dance between knowing what felt good before and remembering what you just learned to make the best decision right now. The big question here is how our brains actually turn what we've learned into an action, especially when learning new things. We know reinforcement learning helps us figure out what is good and what is bad through trial and error. We also know working memory is crucial for holding information in our minds, like remembering a phone number or a set of instructions. But how do these two systems team up to guide us when we're making a decision? And what does that look like in our brains? The researchers wanted to see if they could spot the brain activity that signals this process of gathering evidence to make a decision, similar to what we see when people are just looking at things and deciding what they see. So, how did they do it? They got over 500 people to play a special learning game. Think of it like a brain training exercise. In this game, participants had to learn to associate different pictures or symbols with different button presses. The tricky part was the number of things they had to learn changed. Sometimes it was just 2 associations, other times it was up to 5. This is where working memory gets challenged, because holding on to more associations is harder. At the same time, they were learning which button press led to positive feedback, like a reward, and which didn't. This is the reinforcement learning part. They measured brain activity using EEG, which is like putting a cap with a bunch of sensors on someone's head to pick up the electrical chatter happening in their brain. They were particularly interested in specific brain waves that might signal how the brain is accumulating evidence for a decision. And what did they find? It is pretty cool. They confirmed that different parts of the brain activity are linked to reinforcement learning and working memory, suggesting these are indeed separate but cooperating systems. But the really exciting part is that they found a specific signal in the brain that looks a lot like a signal seen in simple perception tasks called the centroparietal positivity, or CPP. This CPP signal usually builds up over time as the brain gathers more evidence for a decision. In this learning task, they found a similar buildup, but instead of accumulating evidence from what they were seeing, they were accumulating evidence based on their learned values of the choices. Think about it this way. When you're learning, you're not just seeing a stimulus and instantly knowing the answer. Your brain has to process new information, weigh it against what you already know. That is working memory, and consider the potential outcomes based on past experiences. That is reinforcement learning. This evidence-gathering process, this buildup of certainty or uncertainty, seems to be reflected in this CPP signal, even when the decision is based on learned values rather than direct sensory input. They also found that the speed at which this brain signal built up was related to something called the drift rate in their computer model. The drift rate is basically how quickly the brain is making up its mind. If the drift rate is high, the signal builds up fast, meaning a decision is made quickly. If it is low, the signal builds up slowly, and decisions take longer. This is exactly what we'd expect if this brain signal truly represents the evidence accumulation process. Even more impressively, when they used this brain signal, this CPP buildup, to help their computer model predict how people would make choices and how long it would take them. The model got better. This is a really important finding because it suggests that the brain activity they're measuring isn't just a byproduct, it is actively contributing to the decision-making process. It is like having an extra piece of information that perfectly explains why someone made a certain choice at a certain time. And here is where the interplay between reinforcement learning and working memory really shines. They found that when the task was simpler, meaning fewer things to remember, working memory played a bigger role in influencing this brain signal. But when the task got harder, with more things to keep track of, reinforcement learning became more influential in shaping that brain signal. This makes perfect sense, right? If you only have a few things to juggle, your working memory is probably on top of it. But when you're overloaded, you might rely more on your past experiences, your reinforcement learning history, to guide your choices. This suggests a really dynamic partnership. Working memory is great for fast, immediate recall, especially when the load is low. But when the load increases, it is like your brain shifts gears, leaning more heavily on the deeper learned associations from reinforcement learning. So what does this all mean for us? Well, it's a big step towards understanding the brain's decision-making machinery. It shows that the way we gather evidence to make a decision isn't just passive. It's an active process that's influenced by both what we're currently holding in mind and what we've learned over time. The fact that they found this CPP-like signal in a learning context is huge because it suggests that the brain's mechanisms for building evidence might be quite flexible, applying to different types of information, not just raw sensory data. Now, like any study, there are some things to consider. The researchers themselves point out that sometimes brain signals can look alike for different reasons. There is a debate in the field about how much this CPP signal is purely evidence accumulation versus perhaps picking up other related brain activity. However, they did find that even after accounting for some of this overlapping activity, the signal related to decision-making still held up, which is encouraging. They also mentioned that their task didn't have stimulus onset jitter, which might make it a bit harder to perfectly separate the brain activity related to seeing the stimulus from the brain activity related to building up the decision. So future research could refine this. Also, their model wasn't perfect at predicting the times for wrong answers, suggesting there might be other factors, like urgency, that could be at play in those situations. But overall, this study provides really strong evidence that when we learn, our brain is constantly accumulating evidence based on learned values. It's a sophisticated process where working memory and reinforcement learning don't just coexist. They actively shape how we gather that evidence and ultimately make our choices. This could have implications for understanding learning difficulties, decision-making under stress, or even how we develop new habits. It's a peek into the dynamic collaborative work of our cognitive systems. This research highlights how complex learning is and how our brains are constantly working to integrate new information with old, all to guide our actions. It's a testament to the intricate, yet often elegant, way our minds operate. I think it's amazing how we can use tools like EG and computational models to get closer to understanding these fundamental processes. So that's a wrap on this fascinating dive into the science of learning and decision making. What do you think? Does this help explain why some learning tasks are harder than others for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more breakdowns of the latest mind-bending research, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.